Long before vampires became capes, castles, and movie monsters, they were something much more frightening. They were a question whispered beside fresh graves: what if the dead were not staying dead? Across Europe, people had old stories about revenants, bodies that returned from the grave, not always as elegant villains, but as swollen, hungry, restless dead. These stories became strongest when whole families were dying, and nobody understood why. To modern eyes, the signs can sound strange. A body looked too fresh. Blood appeared near the mouth. Hair or nails seemed to have grown. In reality, decomposition can create all of these illusions. But in a terrified village, they looked like proof. One of the earliest named vampire legends comes from Kringa, in Istria. In 1672, according to folklore, villagers said a dead man named Jure Grando returned at night, knocked on doors, and brought death soon after. The story says the village tried prayers first, then weapons. Then, finally, they opened the grave. Whether Jure Grando was real history or legend shaped by fear, the pattern would repeat across Europe: sickness, suspicion, and a body blamed for both. Then came 1725. In the Serbian village of Kiseljevo, then under Habsburg influence, villagers claimed a man named Petar Blagojevic, also reported as Petar Plogojowitz, had returned after death. Several people died in a short period, and panic spread. This case became famous because officials were involved. Reports describe villagers demanding that the grave be opened. When they looked at the body, they believed they saw signs of unnatural life. To them, it was not a superstition anymore. It was an emergency. A few years later, another case exploded in Medveja, Serbia. In 1732, the name Arnold Paole appeared in reports. According to the story, he had once claimed to be troubled by a vampire, then died, and was later blamed for new deaths in the village. The Medveja investigation mattered because it crossed from village rumor into official documentation. Military surgeons and authorities examined bodies. Their reports helped fuel the European vampire craze of the 18th century. Suddenly, vampires were not only campfire stories. They were a subject for governments. Priests were often called because the question was spiritual. Doctors and officials were called because the deaths were physical. And between those two worlds, the vampire took shape, part disease, part corpse, part accusation, part nightmare. Archaeologists have found burials across Europe that seem designed to keep the dead in place. Some bodies were weighed down with stones. Some were pinned, cut, or buried with sharp objects. These finds are not proof that vampires existed. They are proof that people feared them. Near Venice, one famous burial was interpreted by researchers as a possible anti-vampire ritual, with a brick placed in the mouth. In other places, sickles were laid across throats, as if the dead might rise and cut themselves trying to leave. The geography of vampire fear was not random. The Balkans, parts of Eastern Europe, Istria, and later Western newspapers became connected by trade routes, military reports, religious fear, and rumor. The myth moved like smoke across a map. By the time writers turned vampires into aristocrats, the original village panic had changed. The vampire became elegant, intelligent, and seductive. But under the velvet and candlelight, the old terror was still there, a dead thing crossing the border back into the living world. And this fear did not vanish when science arrived. In 1892, in Exeter, Rhode Island, the family of Mercy Brown was struck by tuberculosis. The illness was called consumption, and it seemed to drain life slowly from the people it touched. Some New England families believed the dead could feed on the living from the grave. In the Mercy Brown case, her body was exhumed. What happened next became one of America's most famous vampire panics, tragic, desperate, and very late in history. So were vampires real? The evidence points to something human, but no less haunting. Disease. Misunderstood death. Grief. Decomposition. Religious fear. And communities searching for one body they could blame when the invisible killer kept moving from house to house. But here is the darker thought. If the old stories were true, vampires would not need ruined castles today. They would hide where records are weak, where the lonely disappear quietly, where death already has an explanation, and nobody thinks to open the grave. That is why the vampire survives. Not because history proved it was real, but because history proved something almost as unsettling. Ordinary people, priests, doctors, officials, and families once looked at the dead and truly believed the dead were looking back. The next time you hear a vampire story, forget the cape for a moment. Picture a cold village, a locked churchyard, lanterns in shaking hands, and a crowd gathered around one grave, waiting to see whether the nightmare inside was only human after all.